Genialen Krichten sehr stützlich auf their gods. He wages war, his enemies naked. See sheep sowing Welsh in ignorance, that will damn you all.
Bruh?
The Emperor is not only loathed to have treacheries against the gods, but the anathemic to all human life.
This is from the Demon Prince of Chaos. Bro, what the fuck? I don't know if we should watch this one. Hello, Luton. We're back. Tell us more. Oh! The Last Priest on Earth, Chapter 11.
In the darkest period for mankind, one man would come to the fore. He would unite the tattered remnants of humanity and would rise to become the leader of all. His wisdom and strength unrivaled, his mere presence inspired loyalty. Any other names are all now lost to the mists of time. He is now known only as the Emperor of Man. Thousands of human worlds have been ruined by the warp storms amid the aftermath of the Great War versus the Men of Iron. Human survivors remaining on these planets of anarchy lived in fear of scavengers, raiders, blood-crazed cannibals, and on many worlds the fear of nightmarish demonic incursion. They feared, as their primitive ancestors once had, more than anything, the night, the darkness. The darkness promised only horror, bloodshed, screaming, death, and extremes of violence. Across many planets though, including Terra, not all lived in squalor. Some had forged noble houses or settlements who were able to support large defensive forces. Hulking warriors forged in global wars as mankind fought as it had done many thousands of years before for territory, resources, and the safety of its own people. On Terra itself, many had begun to see a new army marching, an army of thundering giants. Clad in magnificent and powerful armour, they had crushed and swept away any who stood against them, for none could resist their power. War ravaged the planet, and most importantly, old tyrants, dictators and despots were exterminated, and those citizens who remained would pledge to the singular service of this military campaign's architect. The Emperor would stand triumphant on his home, the world of mankind's origin. The death and conflict here would slowly come to a close, for there was no one left to conquer, and more importantly, no one left to question the validity of this imposing golden figure of a man. Uria Olather was a simple man, now an old man, a priest by virtue of personal experience, not wholly indoctrination. A man who had long ago seen this army of giants marching against those who had once favoured the night, for it shadowed their evil deeds. But now they feared it as much as those they had hunted. The end of these dark times should have been something for celebration, to rejoice and be thankful for, not for Uria. His services had once been popular, but no longer. Along with the victory of this powerful army came a wave of disbelief and ridicule for those who believed, those who had faith. Where people once had fear and sought divine protection, now they feared no more. His congregation had dwindled and then all but ceased, yet he remained.
Yo, Raid? Oh, it's my boy.
Uria waited
my
for
boy
his
RT.
midnight
What's
service,
good, dude?
once popular, now rarely.
We'll pause. Hey, thank you so much for the raid, man. I hope you're good. We should hang out again soon. Should we be busy luring? I was luring hard, dude. Thank you. What's up, everybody? We're on a Warhammer 40k lore kick. We started watching about 3 days ago, ish, and we're just like, there's hundreds of hours of it, so we're getting stuck in, dude. So if you're into that, feel free to come hang out, take a seat, put your feet up. But yeah, we're learning about the Emperor of Man and the whole timeline of the Emperor of Man, and we're on part 3. But yeah, Artie, thank you so much. Hope you're good. Hope you had a good stream. What was he playing? Mario Kart? I played Mario Kart yesterday, and I was getting some dubs, man. You need to watch your back, Artie. That's all I'm saying. You need to watch your back. All right, Drift King. Your time's coming to an end real soon. That's all I'll say. 40k lore is the true YouTube meta. Yeah, it's true. It is. Drift King got competition. He does, bro. He doesn't know yet though. He's like sitting in his ivory tower, he's all happy and looking down. He doesn't know, bro. It's coming. Anyway, thank you so much for the raid, man. Welcome, guys. We're gonna get back into it.
He attended, small flames licking the walls as the rain steadily drummed against the roof and the wind lashed against the walls of the church. He heard voices outside. Worshippers finally. No, guests, but unwelcome ones. As the door swung open, he would see darkened figures lit only by the occasional flashes of lightning outside. He didn't feel fear, but he did feel a troubling sense of unease. These were not men of faith, they were men of violence. As Uriah tried his best to welcome them, the hooded figure who stepped forth into the church sternly declined and closed the door to his companions outside. Uriah introduced himself as Uriah Olather, the last priest of the Church of the Lightning Stone. The strange man explained that his name was unimportant, but that he could be referred to as Revelation. They would briefly discuss the artistry of the church and sit to share wine. The strange figure wore clothes much like any other, but his were immaculate. He wore a robe of crimson red and a silver ring with a strange marking upon it, a device even. Revelation had already explained to Uriah that the reason he visited tonight was so as to be able to view this church of his, the last church on Terra, and that history would soon consign these places of worship as relics of the past. He questioned Uriah as to why he still chose to remain. Why did he not want to join with so many others who had heard of this emperor and his crusade to extinguish all forms of religion, spirituality and mysticism, to erase the misplaced beliefs in the supernatural? Uriah was defiant. His beliefs were his own, and his faith was unmovable. He cared not, even if the forces of the Emperor came here to tear down and destroy his church. No warmongering despot could shift his strength of belief. Revelation called him obstinate. Uriah called it faith. Mocking him, Revelation stated, "A willing belief in the unbelievable without proof?" Uriah fired back, "What makes faith so powerful is that it requires no proof. Belief is enough." "I see now why the Emperor wants rid of it," said Revelation. "You call faith powerful. I call it dangerous. Think of what people in the grip of faith have done in the past, all the atrocities committed down the centuries by people of faith. Politics has slain its thousands, but religion has slain its millions." If it were not abundantly clear by this point, the darkened figure who had entered the Church of the Lightning Stone was indeed the Emperor himself, setting foot in the last church on Earth to challenge the last priest and test his beliefs. The absurdity of his arguments clear for any to see given what was to come in the following millennia. From the Emperor would come the Crusades that would crush any who opposed them. In fact, any who were found to have religious beliefs that could not be convinced otherwise or serve some useful purpose were simply slaughtered. And this was before the time of the heresy, where millions would die in the wars of those without faith and those who were consumed by it. Revelation would apologize for his overtly confrontational tone. Uriah accepted, and instead would see more of his church. Revelation would listen to Uriah tell its history. Revelation, the Emperor, would continue to challenge Uriah when he revealed the church's most holy artifact, the Lightning Stone itself. "Why is it holy?" he would ask. "Was it deposited by your god? A man martyred here? A young girl received some revelation?" Uriah would describe how an old man, thousands of years before, deaf and blind, had taken shelter from a storm below the stone, only for it to be struck by lightning, and curing his ailments, it was said to have had healing properties. The townspeople would build a church around this holy stone. The Emperor, examining the stone, stated without showing any special interest or emotion, "Hematite from a banded ironstone formation, exposed by a landslip most likely. That would explain the lightning strike. I'm not being malicious, I'm explaining to you how such a thing could have happened, without any intervention of godly power." The conversations here between the Emperor and Uriah bear a strong similarity to conversations his Primarch sons would have later in time, where they would repeat his cold and indoctrinated beliefs that all could be explained with science. Magnus the Red, prior to the turning of so many of the legions to chaos, spoke of the warp and its entities. "Because they're nonsense, brother. Gods and demons and sprites and witches, you should listen to yourselves. We call it the ocean. It is a product of galactic harmonics, something to be explored. Some of its manifestations seem to be of a sentient kind, at least in outline, but that is not how things are, the way our minds make it appear, what they conjure to help us understand it. We must do our best to make sense of the vortices, and so what do we cling to? The old figures and archetypes once we used when we were scrabbling around in the dirt." Magnus apparently perceived the warp and its entities early on as nothing to be taken any more seriously than the material realm, easily explained rationally because his views were dictated by the Emperor, views that placed many of the Emperor's finest in highly dangerous positions of corrupting manipulation, yet we see these strongly held principles of the Emperor being pushed onto Uriah. The Emperor, at least through his words, appears to fully reject the idea of spiritual beings by explaining away the lightning stone as mere natural events. He goes on to explain to Uriah that this is normal for humans, that a man, especially an already religious man, might perceive that such elemental energy, even if it did have healing properties, would often be seen by your mortal human as something of a divine nature. But that this was something humans do all the time, that they project spirits or fears and dread onto that which they cannot see, onto the darkness or the night, to sounds and senses that we cannot be sure of, that we fear the unknown as much as we place our faith and beliefs in it. The tone and detail with how the Emperor explains Uriah's fixation on the lightning stone being something of divine power somewhat mirrors that of Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, years later, and it's easy for us to see how the Emperor had imbued these preconceived perceptions into his Primarch sons and his legions. If we take for example the traitor Astartes of the Word-Bearers, even in the earliest days of the heresy, they would, in the presence of a demon who had shown them powerfully disturbing visions, still display levels of disbelief and flippancy. The Emperor had so carefully taught them into not being so easily able to accept such things at face value, to dismiss out of hand that they could possibly be the truth. Yet in time their ignorance would be their Achilles' heel, and would lead them to become open to accepting what is known to the creatures of the warp as the primordial truth. Our guitar didn't reach for his weapon.
A guitar didn't reach for his weapon. I'm wondering if, like, the Emperor knew early on that faith was a tool of chaos, and it wasn't so much that he wanted to remove it so that the only thing they worshipped was him. It was that he wanted to weaken chaos, right? So he went around and he purged all faith because faith was the tool of chaos, and by taking it away he crippled the chaos gods, which is why they refer to him as heretical, because he was actively going around and stifling their power.
Instead he laughed. "You are an insane creature. This is the respect you show to a messenger of the gods? What did you expect? That the word-bearers would kneel and accept everything you said as divine mandate? We're done with kneeling, Ingerthal." The resistance of the word-bearers to the demon would of course be short-lived. They had already stepped way over the line by this point, but it does demonstrate that, as we know, the transitions and confrontations for many in the traitor legions were not simply about instant corruption, promises of power, or being just casually rolled over by the entities that reside in the Immaterium. We well know that there was bitter fanatical fighting not just between the established legions during the heresy, but also internally among brothers in their own legions.
Hypocrisy.
The Emperor spoke with Uriah, who was more and more aggravated by the poking and questioning of the...
It's more that the Emperor is incredibly emotionally dumb. All his biggest feelings are from completely misunderstanding that other people have feelings. I feel like, yeah, a big part of his weaknesses, and pretty much all his weaknesses, was that he was so above humanity in terms of ability, potential, knowledge, that he could not he could not empathize with the regular man. He couldn't do it. And so he could never put himself in their shoes, and he overlooked like crucial elements. Like, he wanted to remove faith, but faith is a very important emotion for humans as a whole. And you can't really remove faith, because when you remove faith, he just became the object of their faith. He couldn't stop it. Instead of him being like, faith needs to exist, I need to figure out a way to control it, but still provide it, right? He was like, I need to just get rid of that. And you can't get rid of it. They need it. And I feel like he did so much shit. Like, his sons, right? Like, his sons need emotional reinforcement, right? But in his mind, he's like, no, they're tools. They need to do this, this, and this. So he didn't emotionally reinforce them, and they turned on him. This is like, there's a bunch of shit where he's like, he's just so high above humanity that he can't empathize. And so he misses the mark, like, really often.
This revelation, whoever he was. If I'm adversarial, it is because it infuriates me to see the blinkered willfulness of those who live their lives enslaved to such fantastical notions as are contained in that book and others like it. That damnable piece of thunder in your hands, that book, is 9 centuries worth of agglomerated texts and assembled, rewritten, translated and twisted to fit the needs of hundreds of mostly anonymous and unknown authors. What basis is that to take guidance for your life? If a man claimed his dead grandfather was speaking to him, he would be locked up in an asylum, but if he were to claim the voice of God was speaking to him, his fellow clerics might well make him into a saint. Clearly, there is safety in numbers when it comes to hearing voices. Uriah spat back at this abrasive figure that had invaded his sanctum. This is my faith you're talking about. Show some damned respect. Why should I? Said Revelation. Why does your faith require special treatment? It's not robust enough to stand some questioning? Why should you and your faith be singled out for special treatment? I have seen God, hissed Uriah. If you have had such experience, you may believe it was real, but do not expect me or anyone else to give it credence, Uriah. Just because you believe a thing to be true does not make it so. Uriah maintained his account of having seen and felt God himself and would reference his youth, where by now the thunder armies of the Emperor had already subdued most of Terra. Yet the young Uriah decided he would attempt to find corners of the world not yet conquered by this so-called Emperor with his eagled banners. Yet everywhere he travelled he found only towns and people that were already subdued, giving praise for the Emperor, albeit seemingly with a hollow sense of loyalty. It would not be until years later when he would travel to the land of the Frank and there find a people who had murdered their appointed governor of the Emperor. The townspeople wanted no part of this so-called emperor's rule, and a hastily organised civilian militia slaughtered the appointed soldiers in their barracks. Iconography of the emperor was torn down, and the streets became full of happy songs, dancing children, and joyous people at their newly found self-determined freedom. Uriah explained how the mood was optimistic, positive and confident. More towns heard of the uprising and allied themselves with this stance against the tyrannical emperor figure. When all was said and done, they would have anything like 40 to 50,000 men and women ready to fight and defend their position that they owed nothing to this emperor and would not be made to bow down to his threats of violence. Uriah explained how this had been his dream of an adventure, rebellion, discovering these people willing to stand up to the giant soldiers of the Emperor that he had previously seen march across the world and dominate humanity.
Okay.
Word was spreading that the army of thunder and lightning was marching upon them, and so they would set out to meet it. Their jubilant spirits soared high as they left their homes and towns, locals and children gifting them tokens and keepsakes, filling them with pride and an ever-renewed sense of purpose that ultimately would not last for long. Despite the fact that as they stood ready to face down the Emperor's warriors, they outnumbered them 10 to 1, their ranks revved up to a fever pitch of enthusiasm by many rousing speeches. But as the first charge went forward and the Emperor's giants stood motionless, a moment of concern crossed the minds and the faces of the rebels. And only when they'd crossed half the battlefield did the Emperor's solid wall of giant warriors open fire. The result was instantaneous shock and horror. Their cannon-like rifles created carnage, tearing limbs from torsos, bodies exploding from the inside out in showers of blood and flesh, mentally shattered individuals crawling around in screaming horror, men and women split in half, ruined corpses, sobbing, miserable parodies of human form crawling through the shredded remains of their fellow rebels. Some simply lay or sat confused and stunned from the devastation caused by the first bolts of fire. Whatever these warriors of the Emperor were, they were not men, they were monsters. Uriah recalls falling over bodies split down the middle as if their whole side had been simply ripped clean away. Others heavily wounded were crawling around, begging for mercy. Men and women alike staggering in confusion and fear, finally understood.
Someone explain to you how a bolter works yet? My understanding with a bolter is you get shot with a bullet and then it detonates once it's inside you. Or something? It's not a bullet. It's like a micro rocket. It's like a mini little missile. Yeah, it like pierces you and then you just fucking explode. That was my understanding.
Understanding what it is that they had dared to face, perhaps wondering why on earth they had thought that they could win against such warriors. Why had they put themselves in this position? People began to hastily surrender, knowing the prospect of winning the day was an impossibility. The armoured giant warriors ignored their cries and pleas, marching into the blood-soaked battlefield, hacking and brutalising the severely injured and stunned survivors alike. They began to engage the remaining force that was attempting to disengage from the horror. This was no longer anything that could be called a battle. It was a slaughter by butchers. Before the carnage had ceased, Uriah fled as fast as he could, leaving the screaming, tormented wailing slowly fading in the background. Occasionally, one of the damned must have experienced some extraordinary act of suffering, and their cries were carried high and far across the wind. By the end of it, the massed rebel force was slaughtered within the hour. Tens of thousands of men and women, what was left of them, lay strewn across the battlefield, crushed, ruined, annihilated. Uriah had escaped and lay crying and wounded in the darkness of the night. Seeing a golden face as he lay in his agony was speaking to him. "Why do you deny me? Accept me, and you will know that I am the only truth and the only way." This was his apparent personally experienced vision of God. Revelation, the Emperor, immediately dismisses this as just another instance of humans perceiving what they need to see because of their own mortality, struggling, fighting for life, or seeing some kind of vision to explain away the worthlessness of their own life. But Uriah could not be swayed, and he described how after his vision he fell into a sleep only to awaken, miraculously healed. The shrapnel embedded near to his neck and spine was gone, and he decided as a result of this vision that he needed to travel home. However, upon reaching his hometown, he found that his family had been all but slaughtered and destroyed. His former life was gone, and this was when he would turn to becoming a priest of the Church of the Lightning Stone. Uriah explained how he had wanted to serve God, to spread the word of his church, but the Emperor's forces all but prevented him from spreading his word anywhere, instead spreading their own truth in reason and disregarding any belief of the supernatural.
So he saw the
Uriah
Emperor, right?
finally voiced his understanding.
That's the irony of the
that
whole
he
thing.
knew why Revelation was here to speak with him, that he was here to offer Uriah to join the new ways, but he was still not convinced. The Emperor would try a different approach by describing historical accounts of atrocities committed in the name of religion. Uriah was still not persuaded. Revelation explained that the tales were universal and typify religious behaviour that has been recurring since the beginning of human history. The record of human experience shows that where religion is strong, it causes cruel, intense beliefs and produces intense hostility. Only when faith loses its force can a society hope to become humane. They would argue back and forth, Uriah maintaining that much of a religion's doctrines and texts are not meant to be taken literally. The Emperor exclaiming that this is surely the whole point, that people will pick and choose, and the subsequent confusion that will inevitably arise from such selective reading amounts to an entirely personal interpretation. Worse, those that do take the texts absolutely literally would usually create misery and death, believing the words in the text to be the absolute truth, set in stone, to be unquestioned and strictly executed. The Emperor would recount more ancient histories, from human sacrifices to wartime horrors committed in the name of religion. Bloody wars where thousands would die. Uriah dismissed this as ancient ways long since forgotten, to which the Emperor balked. He pivoted to a more recent event describing death camps and eugenics committed by Cardinal Tang only 30 years previous to their current time. Uriah had had enough. "You fixate on the blood and the death, Revelation. You forget all the good that can be achieved from faith. If you think religion is a force for good, Uria, then you're not seeing the superstitious savagery that pervades the history of our world, said Revelation. It's true that just before the descent of Old Night, religion gradually lost its power over life, but like the worst kind of poison, it lingered and fostered division amongst the people of the world that endured. Without belief in gods, divisions blur with passing ages. New generations adapt.
I think the irony of this is that the Emperor... Yo, what's up, Atron? The Emperor only focuses on the negative elements of religion, and he only focuses on the positive aspects of science, and he quite gleefully overlooks all the atrocities he commits for his viewpoint, which is the exact same shit he's bringing up about religion, right? That's the irony of the whole situation. Is like, he butchered all these people to get here, and he's just citing about how dangerous religion is, but he's just done the same thing.
To new times, mingle, intermarry, and forget ancient wounds. It is only belief in gods and divine entities that keeps them alien to one another, and anything that divides people breeds inhumanity. Religion is the canker in mankind's heart that serves such an ugly purpose. Enough, snapped Uria. I've heard enough. Yes, people have done things terrible to one another in the name of their gods, but they've done terrible things to one another without the recourse to their beliefs. An acceptance of gods and an afterlife is a vital part of what makes us who we are. If you take that away from humanity, what do you suggest takes its place? In my many years as a priest, I have ministered to many dying people, and the emotional benefits of religion's power to console them and those left behind cannot be underestimated. There is a flaw in your logic, Uria, said Revelation. Religion's power to console gives it absolutely no more credence or validity. It might very well be a comfort to a dying man to believe that he'll go to some bountiful paradise of endless joy, but even as he dies with a wonderful smile on his face, it means nothing in the grand scheme of things as far as the truth of the matter is concerned. Maybe not, said Uria, but when my time comes, I will die with my god's name on my lips. There are multiple aspects to read from the discussion between the Emperor and Uria. For one, it's fairly staggering that the Emperor has the gall to recount the many accounts of religious atrocity as examples of why it's such a flawed and dangerous concept for humanity, and that for this, and also other reasons, it's why mankind is better off without it. He makes these statements immediately after he has just sat and listened to Uria recount his own tale of facing down the Emperor's army of giant superhuman warriors, versus a force of what can only be read as being a fairly large, yet seemingly primarily civilian force of angry townspeople. That the Emperor's warriors proceed to not only engage with maximum levels of aggression, but then continue to engage in one of the most inhuman slaughters, brutalizing and committing horrors best not even thought of, and not against a defiant, powerful warlord and his army of trained soldiers. No, they destroyed with no mercy a mob of crying, stunned people who knew that they were defeated as the first shots were fired. You can barely imagine a more inhuman situation. Why this level of violence and display of pure, unfettered aggression was necessary has no explanation. And as they knelt begging for mercy, the Emperor allowed his giant warriors to let their bloodlust run rampant as these monsters often literally crushed under their heavy armoured boots anything that moved, until the ground was nothing more than a hellscape, a wasteland of horror. You'd be forgiven for mistaking them for the worshippers of the blood god, for on this day they surely imbued Khorne with a refreshing burst of power. You can only see these events as shockingly hypocritical on behalf of the Emperor. Within almost the same breath he begins explaining how it is religion that is the terrible enemy of mankind because, through its most extreme beliefs, it can on occasion cause humans to commit terrible atrocities. Why Uria doesn't counter the Emperor with this astonishing level of hypocrisy is frustrating, yet it also highlights to us that the Emperor is operating from a position that is hardly objective or rational. They are simply his talking points to achieve his own agenda, that of removing the very idea of structured religion and spirituality from the human consciousness. As Uria had now essentially turned his back on redemption and returned to his prayers, a golden light would rise from behind him. He turned to face redemption, but was only able to exclaim, "You! Now do you fully understand the futility of what you do here?" said the golden giant. Uria finally understood, seeing the golden face that he'd seen long ago in his memories as he was near to death, after the horrific battle against the Emperor's warriors. "You are the Emperor." The Emperor tells Uriah it is time to go, and they start to leave the Church of the Lightning Stone. The Emperor begins to explain that the artistry within the church is much like humanity, that it is only meant to exist in the light, not reside in the darkness, that only when suffocating shadows of religion are gone will it be able to see again its true brilliance. Uriah passed through his church as he moved to leave and join the Emperor for whatever fate awaited.
Isn't like the Emperor appearing as a divine entity to him in a vision? Isn't that a sign already that so many people have placed their faith in the Emperor that he's becoming a god at that point, right? Like, even this early on, for people to get visions of him, it means that, like, his power in the warp is already manifesting.
Him. The Emperor all the while telling of how it was that he would create an imperium that would make this church appear like a pauper's hovel in comparison. Uriah transitioned quickly from feelings of regret and that his life had been a misguided lie to a renewed sense of self-belief and strength in his faith, even as confused as it had been. Uriah, in this moment, had a realization. One that the Emperor seemed unable to grasp. But the Emperor had made many mistakes through his past and would make many more in the future. The Emperor is not infallible, flawless, or as perfect as the vision he projects to his followers. Perhaps it's the nature of his origin that makes the Emperor seemingly unable to grasp the necessity for religion having a place in the human spirit.
That's exactly what I said.
Had allowed the warmth and love of his God to fill the emptiness within him when he needed it most. This was what made faith powerful, that it required no proof, only belief. Its power was in that it needed no understanding at all. He would follow the Emperor out into the tempest that his church had kept shut out until now. But as the Emperor stepped outside, the howling gale blew in, extinguishing his candles. As he stepped out into the thrashing rain and darkness, lightning illuminated the hundreds of armoured statues outside the church, the Emperor's warriors. They stepped forward and proceeded to put fire to the church and throw in grenades for good measure. The Emperor watched it burn. Uriah protested, but it was in vain. The Emperor knew exactly what he was doing and exactly what his plans for humanity were. His Imperium had no place whatsoever for gods and spirituality. Uriah argued with the Emperor over his vision for the future, declaring him a madman as the Emperor laid out his plans to conquer the galaxy. The warriors standing in their presence were only the precursors, he explained. The warriors he was forging would be the generals and lead the greatest crusade to every corner of the galaxy. Uriah protested. Didn't you just tell me of the bloody slaughters perpetuated by crusaders? Doesn't that make you no better than the holy men you were telling me about? The difference is, I know I am right, replied the Emperor. Spoken like a true autocrat, came Uriah. Emperor shook his head. You misunderstand, Uriah. I've seen the narrow survival path that is all that stands between humanity and extinction.
The difference
this is the way it must begin.
I'm right.
This was when Uriah would finally see the truth of the Emperor, and tell him that to deny humanity a thing would only make them crave it more so, and if he were successful, to be wary that his followers do not mistake him for a god lest they begin to worship him. Uriah could see through the gold and the blinding light now. This was not a god, for he could see the burning ambition and the white-hot core of violence in the heart of the Emperor. I wish only the best for my people, promised the Emperor. I think you do, but I will not be a part of it, said Uriah.
So this guy was like, I'm a priest, and I'm telling you now, the path you walk will make you a god to everyone around, to all the people you've subjugated. And he was like, it won't, I know what I'm doing.
With that, Uriah would turn and walk back into the burning church. He walked straight into the blaze as the flames closed around him. Outside, the warriors watched the church until it collapsed. By morning, only smouldering ruins remained. The Emperor turned away, saying only, "Come, we have a galaxy to conquer." The only sound to be heard was the chiming of an old and broken clock.
Damn, son. Come. I will not come.
The small clock in this story I've omitted until the end as it has a specific relevance and really a tale all of its own. Uriah had owned a small bronze clock described as having a cracked glass face and clean, delicate hands made of gold with inlaid mother of pearl. Its cogs never turned and its pendulums never swung. He'd stolen this in his youth, where he travelled the earth looking for whatever kind of youthful adventure he could come across, and he'd stolen this timepiece from a silver palace in the mountains of Europa. He recalled how as he had fled this palace, the craftsman who curated the many strange timepieces kept there called screaming after him that the clock was counting down to doomsday and would chime when the last days of mankind's existence were at hand.
Oh shit.
Uriah at the time youthfully laughed off these eccentric craftsmen's bizarre calls and would gift the clock later to his father. But after Uriah returned to their home,
Nah, I know I'm right. Sounds like you, Strippin. Shut the fuck up, dude. No, it doesn't. Okay? That does not sound anything like me, bro. It does. Brune, you don't know what you're talking about. You are wrong. And I am right. You do not know what you're fucking talking about. Okay?
home to find his family essentially destroyed, he retrieved the clock, bringing it to the Church of the Lightning Stone, where it would make no sound since that day. Uriah had always dreaded hearing its chimes, and he would never have to hear it chime again. The chiming of the clock as the Emperor walks away from extinguishing the last church on Earth is meant to herald the doom of mankind. But why? What is its significance? It's clearly symbolic, as the last church is burned to the ground and the last priest on Earth has engaged with the Emperor. Each gave one another the chance to side with each other's presented opinion. Instead, they both choose to go their own separate ways. The Emperor with his plans for galactic secular domination, the last priest on Earth finally realizing that it is not the existence of a god in the physical sense that is the true power of faith, but having belief is enough, and nothing would make him regret that. This clock, though, appears again in the most unlikely of places. Many years later, Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, would be overcome with a powerful vision, a vision of things that could never be. Worlds on fire, battlegrounds of Astartes he saw slaughtering each other with blades and fists, landscapes riddled with scars and corruption, battlefields fought at a microscopic level where only bacteria and viruses remained. As he looked through the putrid, nightmarish landscapes, he would find his eyes focus in on something he recognized more clearly, the markings of the Lunar Wolves and Horus Lupercal. He shouted, but they could not hear him. He would see fragmented and mixed visions of friends and foes, blades striking fatal blows, a strange temple with pillars of fire, and a black pool that appeared as dark as oil. A powerful figure broke through the fractured pieces to coalesce. It was Horus. Magnus inspected it more closely. This thing, it was not Horus. "What are you?" demanded Magnus. "You are not my brother." "Not yet, but soon," answered the monster with a maddening grin. "My brother would never unleash this madness. Then you don't know him, for it is happening right now. The pawns of the primordial annihilator are already in motion, setting the traps of pride, vanity and anger to ensnare the egos of the knights required to topple the king." "You lie," said Magnus. "Do I?" laughed Horus. "Horus Lupercal will betray you all. He will set the Imperium ablaze in his quest for power. Nothing will survive. All will become a nuclear cauldron of chaos, from the supermassive heart of the galaxy to the guttering stars in its halo." "Where will this miraculous transformation take place?" asked Magnus, fighting to keep the growing horror from his voice. "On a little moon," giggled the monster, "in the Davin system." "Even if I believe you, why tell me? Because it has already begun. Because I enjoy your torment, and because it's too late to stop this," said Horus. "We'll see about that," promised Magnus. Magnus opened his eye, and the Horus monster was gone. Ahriman and the Terminator guards surrounded him, their faces filled with dread. "My lord," cried Ahriman, "what happened?" Magnus shrugged off any help and climbed to his feet. He could already feel the sands of time moving across the face of the galaxy, and he had a brief, last flash of a vision, of a chiming bronze timepiece with a cracked glass face and mother-of-pearl hands.
Damn, son.
The vision of Magnus couldn't be clearer. The meddling form of Horus is very clearly Tzeentch, especially as it is appearing before Magnus the Red. Tzeentch, the meddling god of change, twisting and manipulating. Magnus could not have known the meaning of seeing the chiming ancient clock. It's really just the mischievously twisted playfulness of Tzeentch at work. And questions remain on who the craftsman back on Terra really was and how he foresaw the accuracy of the clock and its chiming. The two instances are very much connected though. The Emperor himself had a choice. Why did he never warn anyone, not even his prized sons the Primarchs, of the dangers of the spirits, the entities and gods that resided in the warp? His turning away from the Church of the Lightning Stone on Terra as its smouldering remains and all they symbolise were left to ruin was a definitive moment where the Emperor set humanity on a path that rejected totally religion and spirituality and followed only the Emperor's imperial truth. The Emperor had a choice: to bestow his knowledge of the Chaos Gods and the warp to his sons, but forbid them from ever attempting to make any kind of dealings with what inhabited the Immaterium. Now, if he had chosen to do this, you could argue that he would have armed them with the knowledge to know of the manipulating and pervasive nature of chaos and better enable them to avoid its temptations and its corrupting allure. Yet, with that said, has it not been shown time and time again that forbidding anyone in humanity to not open that box that's marked "Do Not Open" is a recipe for disaster?
True.
And I believe this was really the position the Emperor found himself in. If he had forbidden his Primarchs from ever exploring and interacting with these beings or explaining to them the true nature of chaos and his plans for humanity, he ran the risk of them being unable to resist the forbidden fruit. It's the oldest tale of humanity, always needing that thing which you can never have. Making something off limits only makes it far more desirable. It's human nature. So instead, the Emperor opted for his only real alternative: to say nothing and hope for the best. Yet this came with its own problems. The Emperor, via the Imperial Truth, did his best to stave off any kind of dangers that might arise from chaos, yet this was nowhere near enough. Not to mention the fact that, as would later be discovered, the Emperor had not only chosen to selectively impart wisdom to his Primarch sons, but that he had carefully misled and actively deceived them. Under the crushing weight of so many miscalculations on the part of the Emperor, the growing apathy and diminishing sense of respect felt by Horus could only lead to one thing:
I like that they have it. It's a little like open-ended because it's like chaos corrupted Horus, but chaos didn't really corrupt Horus because you can argue that it would have happened anyway. Like chaos just kind of pushed Horus down a path that it's debatable he was going to go down anyway. It's weird, man. The Emperor really fucked up. The Horus Heresy audiobooks are super top tier quality. Highly recommend. All right, man. We'll check them out. Hey, Harper, thank you for the gift bomb. Thank you so much. The worst part is Horus was a real nice guy. I mean, Horus gets fucked over bad, right? By the other guy. It wasn't actually Horus. It was the other guy with the sword that wounded him. And fucking forced him to go into, like... It was Erebus. Yeah, it was Erebus that fucked it. Horus got manipulated by Erebus. I always find it weird that it's like Horus is responsible. Horus led this shit. Because I guess it's easier to pin it on Horus than Erebus. Because Erebus is kind of like not that important. But it was Erebus that did it. Anyway, nobody knows it was Erebus except the consumer. Right, so everyone in this world thinks it was Horus. They don't realize that Horus was manipulated by Erebus. Because it was like, he did it super subtly in a vision, like blah, blah, blah. And instead they blame Magnus, because Magnus warned everyone and fucked up the webway. And so he became a scapegoat when he was totally innocent. Not innocent because he fucked up. He was innocent in a chaos sense. What's up,
The
cool?
Emperor's vision for humanity was one of progression, forward-thinking rationalism, a return to science and logic, as well as a powerful sense that humanity were the ones who were best placed to take on the role as the most powerful race in the galaxy. The Eldar had their chance and failed. The remaining Xenos were abhorrent savages. As the Emperor began his galactic crusade, he decreed that his imperial truth be brought to all the worlds of mankind, essentially by any means necessary, peaceful if possible, by force otherwise. The hypocrisy of the Emperor given his self-righteous rantings against religion is blinding. His primary criticisms against religion were that it caused ignorance and horrific bloodshed when humans interpreted things wrongly or with an extreme perception of the teachings from their religion of choice. Yet on so many occasions the Emperor shows almost no regard whatsoever for human life. Far from being a benevolent leader who cares for its human species, because remember, after all, the Space Marine Legions were meant to be a tool to bring about the rise of humanity, not a permanent, ever-present military force that would last for tens of thousands of years. In one sense, the Emperor's grand plans seem to have barely got off the ground before it all came crashing down. Despite his crusade in many ways being a success, the whole vision and mission on behalf of the Emperor in the end was a catastrophic failure. An empire in flames, mass slaughter across so many worlds, return to the darkness of spirituality, persecution, and worst of all, the Emperor in the end left humanity in a position arguably little better off than when he had begun. It's clear to all the Emperor is no ordinary man. Exactly what the Emperor is and just how much power and knowledge he had is always something of a grey area. We know that the Emperor is and was a perpetual, and this has been established in one way or another since the very beginning of Warhammer 40,000. And it's fairly obvious though when you think about the fact that he's existed since the earliest times, no matter which origin story you subscribe to. And I am far more open to the shaman sacrifice origin than I had been. However, I still do like the idea that the Emperor is somehow a creation of some final old one. But full disclosure, there is basically zero evidence for that. It's simply a fun thought out loud of mine. Questionable as well if a single old one could create such a powerful being whilst on the run. The shaman sacrifice though works equally well if you get into the details of it. Really though, the heart of the matter is that the Emperor is an immensely powerful individual. Brand new information. Where we come to the unclear and hazy aspect is just how is he a perpetual compared to others, say Vulcan Primarch of the Salamanders? And this is where we risk going off into pretty heavy tangents that deals with the area of the Emperor's dealings with the Chaos Gods and his acquisition of knowledge to create the Primarchs. The long and short of it is that I do not believe the Emperor to be a perpetual in a sense of how it is often described. The perpetuals are just...
What do they mean by a perpetual? Does that mean like immortal? Like when you die you come back? Is that a perpetual? Immortal, he can't die. So most demons, most powerful demons in the universe are perpetuals, right? Archdemons, when they die, they go back to the warp, they're reborn. Not in the same way as demons. It's different. Right, okay. A perpetual is a special type of human that will straight up respawn when they die. Oh, they'll literally regenerate on a cellular level and wake back up after death. Yes. Right, okay. So Vulcan is the Primarch that inherited the Emperor's perpetual ability. And none of the other Primarchs did. Yes. So why don't they just let the Emperor die? And he'll just come straight back. Nobody knows he's a perpetual? Oh, fuck. Okay. It's speculated the battle with Horus actually removed his perpetuality. Oh, because the wound he struck didn't heal. There are different types of perpetuals. Some only have one life and just don't age. Some respawn. I see. His life powers the astronomer. When he dies, it goes out and the warp will erupt from Terra itself thanks to the damage done by Magnus. Okay, so even if he dies just for 30 seconds, it will be 30 seconds of uninterrupted demons pouring into Terra before he would even come back to life. And so they just can't take the risk, and they have to just keep him on life support on the doorway. So if Magnus hadn't switched sides, Magnus could, in essence, sit on the throne instead of the Emperor and keep the Woodway closed. But he switched sides, so they can't use him. Because he was the only person strong enough to cover for the Emperor. He was meant to sit there. That was literally his planned role. Oh my god, dude. Why wouldn't you be like, look, I know you guys think I fucked up, okay? And I kind of did, but I'm not evil. Let me sit on the throne. I'll prove it. And then he sits on the throne. They don't have a fucking choice anyway. But then he's like, you guys don't believe me. I'm leaving to join Chaos. And then he goes and joins Chaos. Oh, I get it. It's because... Hang on. Is it because the Space Wolves were supposed to get Magnus and arrest him and bring him to the Emperor, but Horus, who was already tainted, told the Space Wolves, kill Magnus. So the Space Wolves attacked Magnus, and he was like, I can't go home. I can't go back. So he ends up joining the Chaos, because there's nowhere else for him to go. Precisely. Okay, that makes sense. I was like, why didn't he just go home? Okay, that makes sense.
Kind of magical entities who somehow come back to life and are basically immortal. If anything, the description's often touted for perpetual.
By the way, just so you guys know, after we finish the Emperor of Man series, we're going to straight into the Space Wolves and the Month of Shame. That's like our next thing I want to learn about.
Are extremely vague, misleading with very little reference, and this also ties into the very notion of the primordial truth. The original explanation for the Emperor following this shaman account was that the warp was a peaceful and calm realm, a mirror of our material space that existed on another plane of existence. It was a neutral and peaceful life stream of spiritual energy. In the early days of mankind, the warp and the creatures within it had not come to any positions of power. Remembering that the warp itself functions not through some sense of religious worship, but simply by being filled with the natural psychic resonant forces, at this time by more passive plants and animals. The activities of others in the galaxy would undoubtedly have begun to fill the warp with more and more troubling energies. But it was with the ever-growing souls of mankind and their obsessive, guilt-ridden negative energies where the warp really began to fill. On Earth, the primitive humans had developed a relationship with the warp that they did not initially understand, but over time would begin to realize how to use it. Those who understood this best were tribal shamans who could tap into the warp and use its energy to help heal and provide for their tribes. You could also be reborn from the warp and carried forward into new human vessels, and in many ways you can see how these shamans were indeed the first perpetuals. Because they never truly died, they would be reincarnated. And this is depending on how strict you want to be with your definitions. However, as mankind grew and the disturbances in the warp became more powerful and more aggressive, and this was before even the Chaos Gods, the shamans began to discover that they were unable to be so easily renewed by reincarnation. The warp was unstable, it was becoming just more challenging, and sometimes spirits would be lost. Fearing that as time would pass this would herald the end of their kind, they decided after many years of discussion to en masse commit suicide, and as they did so, their kind would be gone forever from the earth. Yet they would be reborn as one individual, the Emperor of Man. He would not only bear the combined powers of the many thousands of psychically attuned shamans, but also begin to remember their wealth of group knowledge. He remembered that in his rebirth he was imbued with their collective strength, so that he might live forever, never again having to return to the warp, which would in the days of the future prove to be far too hostile, and too dangerous to allow him to be reincarnated were he ever to die. This original understanding for me is one...
Yeah, also I'm realizing, now that the Chaos Gods exist, they would absolutely never let him make it back, right? If he died and his soul went to the warp, there's no fucking way they would let that soul get back to a human vessel. In a million years. That's probably what they're waiting for. He would just be battling them in the warp forever, like the, what are the other guys? The Vengeance Marines? Legion of the Damned. That's it. Yeah, the Legion of the Damned. Now the Emperor is way more powerful than all the four gods together. Are you sure? You sure about that? I don't know, man. Slanesh kind of powerful, bro. Doubt. Yeah. I don't think that's true anymore, man. I think it was probably true at one point, but... Ugh.
Reason why the concept of killing the Emperor so he can be reborn
he might be stronger than
is
one of
a
the gods,
fundamentally
but not all. Yeah,
terrible
I would
idea,
agree with that.
but that should probably remain a separate discussion. For us, though, the important information from this version of Earth's ancient history is the idea of the Emperor as a perpetual, that this was gifted to him by the collective reincarnation.
He went into the warp before. He made Tzeentch his bitch and beat Khorne to a bloody pulp. Okay, that's a story for another day, I think.
Of the shamans of old Earth. Now, remembering this, we return to the Emperor standing in the Church of the Lightning Stone. From his own perspective as a perpetual, he cannot fathom the importance or the need some humans have for faith, nor does he subscribe to the concept of the primordial truth, a truth that at this point he
This is
surely
what I was talking
well
about,
knows.
chat, where he just lacks,
The Emperor
he lacks
is not
any
a god
empathy.
in the sense of a god being all-knowing and all-seeing. He is an astonishingly powerful individual, to be sure, but he makes a catalogue of misjudgments. He also proclaims to be working for the betterment of humanity, as he describes to Uriah outside the Church of the Lightning Stone.
He claims to be working for the betterment of humanity, but he doesn't quite understand humanity. And that's like the main problem.
The Emperor looked down at him and said, "Some things are best left forgotten." "Then I hope you've foreseen the consequences of a world bereft of religion," said Uriah. "I have," replied the Emperor. "It is my dream. An imperium of man that exists without recourse to gods, a united galaxy with terror at its heart." "A united galaxy?" said Uriah, averting his gaze from his blazing church as he finally grasped the scale of the Emperor's ambition. "Indeed, now that unity has been achieved on Terra, it is time to reclaim humanity's lost empire among the stars. With you at its head, I presume," said Uriah. "Of course, nothing of such grand scale can be achieved without a singular vision at its heart, least of all the reconquest of the galaxy." "You are a madman," said Uriah. Uriah knew he wanted nothing to do with anything this man had to offer, no matter how noble or lofty his ambitions may be. "I hope in the name of all that is holy, you're right," said Uriah, "but I dread the future you're forging for humanity." And as we heard before, the Emperor replied, "I wish only the best for my people." "I think you do, but I'll be no part of it," said Uriah. There's a large part of wisdom on behalf of Uriah in his final conversation with the Emperor. The Emperor also reveals himself to be a hypocrite, and far from wishing the best for his people, he's singularly focused on executing his vision for humanity by any means and any cost necessary. Even if that means the slaughter of innocents, then so be it. However, it appears that Uriah's words may have resonated with the Emperor somewhat, because for as much as the Emperor had declared that his Imperium would operate from a secular position of science, logic and reasoning, there was a strong sense of practices that ran through the Imperium that had more than a flavour of spirituality to them. The terrifyingly powerful presence of his warriors on many worlds were enough to make its inhabitants be awed into thinking they were being visited by some powerful spirits or holy figures. Of course, the iterators would arrive to tell them about the imperial truth and how they needed to follow a secular order, but as much as this was true, it still required a sense of faith. Maybe not faith in the spiritual sense, but faith in the Emperor. And this is really where you get into the muddy territory of defining faith or defining gods and defining spirituality. Where are the lines drawn? Is unquestioning faith in your leader significantly different than unquestioning faith in your god? The Emperor, it seems, knew that he could never fully extinguish the desire for humanity to be awed by things that they did not understand, that they had a need to place their faith in beings beyond their comprehension, and through the belief of the imperial truth, preaching it as a priest conducts a sermon, the Emperor managed to turn his truth into a faith. And just as Uriah had predicted, it was not long before the Emperor's arguably mixed messaging on imposing a secular rule, yet simultaneously himself appearing as a glowing light of golden godlike purity with a shimmering halo and unbelievable power, It doesn't take a genius to realize that quite quickly some of the faithful are going to be more faithful than others. And yet again the Emperor, for all of his apparent foresight and power, could not foresee his own Astartes, first some of them worshipping him, and then slowly sliding into betrayal and finally outright rebellion.
The real imperial truth.
The real imperial truth is that the Emperor's war on religion was not singularly about moving humanity from the darkness into the light. The Emperor surely knew that humanity would face as yet unseen horrors. He had at the very least some awareness of these things from his encounters with the Void Dragon, and he knew very much about the gods of chaos. His suppression of religion seems in part on the same track as his ban on any AI development. He knew that the consequences for allowing either could be potentially catastrophic. And it's worth just highlighting something I see far too often incorrectly described. The Emperor didn't oppose religion because he thought that somehow this would diminish the powers of chaos. Why would it? For starters, chaos doesn't work like that. The warp doesn't work like that. The warp is a realm of resonating spiritual energy that mirrors real space, the materium, the warp being the immaterium. So praying to your gods is not going to have some direct, huge effect, and so neither would be removing that. What the warp thrives on and is fueled by is human emotions, ambitions, and desires. This is why on Chaos ships you don't have huge prayer chambers. You might instead find humans or screaming, lashed astropaths to the foul interior walls of their ships, carving demonic runes into their flesh, branding them, cutting them, and allowing their psychic energy and souls to be consumed, their emotions pouring into the immaterium, until their bodies are disintegrating, riddled with black stinking cancers and foul liquids pouring from their orifices. When it comes to interacting with the warp, it's very much a case of actions speak louder than words. And if that means flaying the skin off of so many humans that are captured onto your ship until the deck is literally awash with blood and your entire room is strung up with skins lashed all around the place, then that's exactly what you're going to do if you want to be able to communicate with your demon spirit in the warp. And that is, by the way, an actual example. The Emperor sought to eradicate religion and spiritual superstition because he feared what he already knew, that the forces of chaos lay waiting out among the stars. This is why his arguments to Uriah were so hollow. He had little in the way of sincerity for his specious beliefs. The Emperor knew from his own experience what awaited humanity, and a society open to the concepts of religion and spiritual beings would be far more easily tempted than one who operated from a position of logic and reasoning. Cults and religious sects could empower the beings of the Immaterium not through their worship, but by their associated actions. And a society open to worship could easily be manipulated into worshipping a cult or organized religion that was not openly worshipping one of the gods of chaos. It may not have even been aware that it was, but this is how chaos operates: manipulation and half-truths. The Emperor had two choices before him: the path of the light and the path of the dark. No matter his agreements in principle with the gods of chaos, he had chosen the path of light for humanity, and he did not want to end up in a situation where his imperial truth could be surreptitiously replaced by the primordial truth. The terrors of the past had grown in the shadow of superstition and false belief. If the human future was to survive its rebirth, it could not tolerate the delusions of the past. The arguably greatest deception the Emperor ever imposed on humanity was the imperial truth. The truth that was, of course, in fact, a lie.
The Imperial... I see. So the demons refer to it as the chaos referred to it as the Imperial lie, and they call their shit the primordial truth. Because he did just fucking lie.
The Emperor knew this was all a lie. He had known this since before the unification, from before the Age of Strife, before the fall of mankind during the Dark Age of technology. The lie being that the spirits, gods, entities, call them whatever you will, but do not deny their existence beyond our realm of perception. It is simply enough, after all, to believe. Some would have it that the imperial truth was never a lie. Mock these fools. Shun them. For they would entangle themselves and yourself in blinkered fallacious arguments and word-splitting games until you both were drowning in self-consuming ignorance, dragged down under the weight of their self-imposed obfuscation. These architects of confusion are to be dismissed and ignored. The primordial truth was simple and clear. The realm of humanity at one time would have called it hell, or the underworld. It was creation's shadow. It was the layer behind the stars. It was chaos, and it was real. To accept the primordial truth is to live in harmonic union with the powers of chaos. It is to accept reality, to embrace power over terror. Without the gods, humanity will die, piece by piece, under the predation of aliens that lay claim to the galaxy. Those who remain will die as the Eldar died, in agony, unable to see the primordial truth before their very eyes. This is fate. It is written in the stars. I feel it's worth reminding everyone at this point that the Emperor, if we're using people's preferred shaman analogy for his inception, was originally produced out of a fear that the warp would become dramatically more hostile, which it ultimately would. That without the shaman's intervention, the human race would be consumed by the spiritual psychic creatures of the warp. Given the origins, it's not surprising that the Emperor would choose the path of light for humanity, as opposed to the path of darkness. At the same time, this image of him as a benevolent protector seems fundamentally misplaced. The Emperor is ruthless, and more than willing to achieve his plans by whatever means. An entirely fallible individual as well. Those worshippers of the Emperor, the most loyal and the most faithful, would have you believe that everything that comes to pass is part of the Emperor's grand plan, or at the very least workable around his long-term intentions. It's difficult to see how that can be true. If anything, the Emperor's persistent declarations that he was just a man, despite all of the evidence of his great powers, seems significantly disingenuous. Yet one feature of him seems certainly true when it comes to assertions, that being his judgment. The Emperor displayed an arrogance that has perhaps always been present in him since his birth, assuming that he could triumph permanently over the gods of the Chaos realm. The Emperor knew of the primordial truth from the very beginning. He had already visited the gods of chaos millennia before his unification wars, and had begun enforcing his declaration that all his followers obey the imperial truth. Some would say that this was part of the Emperor's grand plan, or that he had some miraculous plan of ascension for humanity. Maybe that he planned in the fullness of time to either starve, destroy, or permanently protect humanity from the gods of the warp. Anything is possible, and we currently have nowhere near enough information to make that determination. But anyone who would at this point put their unquestioning faith in the Emperor should seriously take some time to re-examine the facts of the matter. The Emperor operates from a position of just taking whatever action is necessary. Unfortunately, sometimes that means getting your hands dirty, the end justifying the means and so forth. Desperate times call for desperate measures. But does the desperation of humanity warrant the casual slaughter of so many innocents? Humanity never asked for the Emperor. They were subjected to his campaigns of brutal violence, subjugated. Any resistance to the Emperor's order was met with sickening violence. During the Crusades, the Emperor saw much success and many resolutions without a shot being fired, but there were plenty more where this was not the case, and if the Emperor's abhorrent war crimes on terror were anything to go by, it was no small misstep. I've often heard it said that the situation that occurred with the Interrex was not one of the Emperor's making, yet I ask myself, wasn't it? The Interrex, one of the few empires of humanity to survive the Age of Strife, seemingly intact and in an advanced state of technology, its warriors wearing similar armour to Astartes, and proving more than just a challenge for multiple legions. They had working STC systems.
Is this the colony they found that was very advanced where the sword was stolen? Where Erebus stole the sword? Yes.
They should have been a bounty and a prize for not just the Emperor, but for humanity. In another time, the Interrex could have potentially been far superior saviours of humanity. They already seemed to have an established rational order of logic and science and reasoning about their culture. The Emperor's forces in the Crusades, when you really look at it, not so much. Perhaps if they had had some way to know what was coming their way, they could have been more adequately prepared and mounted their own crusade, even becoming more successful than the Emperor's forces. It's unlikely, but it's just worth remembering that the Interrex were there and they were doing just fine. They didn't ask for or want to be part of the Imperium or the Imperial Truth. Horus, already turning away from the Emperor, instigated the war with the Interrex, and it's not entirely without the influence of chaos that things ended up how they did. But again, Horus turning away from the light does not leave the Emperor blameless. Given what we know now, it seems the Emperor simply made a terrible miscalculation in not bestowing his Primarchs with the truth of the events that had taken place up to the point of his crusade. Now you can perhaps understand the Emperor's desire to reduce and outlaw religion so as to not give the Chaos Gods an easy win by laying open the likelihood of some forms of worship and the associated acts that would strengthen them in the warp. It's even understandable that the Emperor simply wanted a path away from this kind of superstition and to try to get back to the way things were for humanity during the Golden Age. The Emperor wants to return mankind to its place of power, its zenith of understanding and rationalism. In his efforts to achieve this, it's entirely possible that he was just trying to get there too quickly and taking shortcuts to achieve what he could have done with a longer, more steady conquest. And there may have been in actuality no perfect solution to all of this. The Emperor was doing the best he could under impossibly difficult circumstances. And something I've often heard as well is if the Emperor survived through the Golden Age and had these genetic laboratories and so on, why did he not keep an STC or two to boost humanity back to the Golden Age? This is a very good question, because from how STCs are portrayed, it certainly would have been a quick fix for regaining the lost technology and bringing humanity back from the edge of annihilation. Why the Emperor seemingly did not have any kind of complete STC stored away or in his possession is of course unknowable for us, but we could make a few speculations. As I discussed before in my previous narrative about STCs, despite them being portrayed as the Holy Grail, perhaps in actuality STCs are just not all they're cracked up to be. It seems beyond strange that if they were these holy grails of all human knowledge, that the Emperor would not have thought to himself, I'd better get myself one of these, just in case. Now another possibility, maybe they were rarer than descriptions would have us believe. The war with the Men of Iron, from what we've learned, doesn't sound as if it just exploded overnight. So if things were turning bad again, you might imagine the Emperor would see the writing was on the wall and secure an STC. The other rationale could be that, as I've said, the Emperor is far more capable of making mistakes and his ability to foresee the future is nowhere near as powerful as we're led to believe. Or perhaps he does get very clear visions, but only of very specific events. This is often used as a crutch to explain away the whole heresy and the Horus battle with the Emperor was all part of his master plans. So if you are to assume he knew all, he would have known Horus would betray him and allow events to play out as they did. Perhaps.
Or, the only other thing I can think of is like an STC has quite literal documented evidence of like chaos and chaos meddling affairs, right? And so he was like, I gotta get rid of that too. Fuck it. They'll just have to trust me.
Perhaps for some greater purpose we are yet to see. We could assume that perhaps the Chaos Gods extended their powers to blind or to cover things from the Emperor. We know that very powerful psychic manipulation is possible.
It's worth noting that we don't actually know if the Emperor can see the future or whether he was just predicting things based on what he saw in the warp. The STCs can be corrupted by chaos. Ah, okay. It's never really explained what STC is. They're like, oh, it holds all knowledge, but like other people say like, oh, it was a 3D printer. Like that could print, like, and make anything you needed with any resource, and it's just like, okay, sounds a little bit too good to be true. In recent lore, an STC with an active AI was found, and it shit-talked the Empire before leaving. Considering Kurz and Sanguinius both had foresight, pretty sure Emperor must have had it as well. Yeah, that makes more sense.
Possible
because they all inherited, like, they didn't inherit all his traits, but they all got some of his traits, right?
Truth of things. It's been used on many occasions by both loyalists and traitors hiding ships, fleets, entire moons. Some consider that the Emperor is far more powerful than any can imagine, that all of his actions are according to a grand plan that he's forged over millennia, and that he will still lead humanity to the light out of the darkness. That he will bring the reascension of mankind. How this would be achieved, however, remains entirely unclear. Some speculate that his plan was to lead all of mankind into the webway, out of the grasp of chaos, yet this is more than off the table after it was breached and the war in the webway fought, with it finally being sealed as the Emperor is permanently interred on the Golden Throne. If all I have said has not convinced you, then perhaps the Emperor himself will have to speak for me. Because when all is said and done, the Emperor could see he had failed humanity. He even admitted it. It's why he was forced to create the Order of the Grey Knights and the Inquisition. And the Emperor described the Grey Knights thusly: one unbreakable shield against the coming darkness, one last blade forged in defiance of fate. Let them be my legacy to the galaxy I conquered, and my final gift to the species I failed. Now, the words of the Emperor here always strike me as especially troubling. It's not his admission of failure that bothers me, it's the words forged in defiance of fate. This suggests that the Emperor seemingly knew that this was destined to pass, that it was inevitable. Perhaps he could see all that was to come after all. He could see what was coming, yet was unable to alter the path, ultimately resigning himself to admitting failure. He had tried to alter humanity's fate, but failed, which returns us once again to chaotic demons speaking the primordial truth, the inescapable truth. The Eldar failed when their test came, but humanity still had the choice to make. That humanity needed to open itself to chaos, as much as chaos needed the more powerfully resonating souls of humanity to fuel it in the Immaterium. The Emperor had already spoken about how dangerously narrow the path of humanity was when he spoke with Uriah, the Church of the Lightning Stone, in their final words. "Didn't you just tell me of the bloody slaughters perpetuated by crusaders?" said Uriah. "Doesn't that make you no better than the holy men you were telling me about?" "The difference is, I know I am right," said the Emperor. Spoken like a true autocrat, the Emperor shook his head. "You misunderstand, Uriah. I've seen the narrow survival path that is all that stands between humanity and extinction, and this is the way it must begin." It certainly seems that before his legions of Astartes had even been completed, or his Primarchs, the Emperor knew that the path they were walking was an extremely narrow one, which had a very limited chance of success. His final acts, much like his other decisions, seemed to be that of a man making the best choices he could given the cards he was holding at the time, trying his best to put right what once went wrong. The primordial truth, though, is a troubling issue. In one sense, it's the simple admission that the Chaos Gods and their realm exist. I personally feel it runs much deeper than that. The impression I have had from the demons who have mentioned it is that it's much more than just an admission of existence. It's about humanity being open to accepting what the Eldar could not, that we cannot exist or survive without its help, that like it or not, the destiny of mankind and the Immaterium are inexorably linked. It's a symbiotic relationship that began at the dawn of man. Perhaps the Emperor could foresee the end times through his immense psychic power, and what he saw he could not accept. It set him inevitably on a path to save humanity from the darkness. As he described it, humanity was never meant for darkness. Only in the light can it achieve its full potential. When the suffocating shadows of a religion that teaches us not to question is gone from this world, we will see its true brilliance. In these words, I think we can understand the Emperor's vision. He did not want humanity to fall into the grasp of the Chaos Gods. He had seen mankind at the highest point in its existence, and he had seen it fall. But he knew that no other race in the galaxy deserved to rule more than man. He was obsessed with making his vision a reality, no matter what the cost. This approach unfortunately imbued itself into humanity, where the ruthless achieve your goals by any cost approach would become fundamental to the Imperium's operation. Not forgetting, of course, the Emperor's perhaps unintended consequence of forbidding religion, which would later ironically become one of its most powerful strengths.
Yep.
The Emperor had feared that religious worship and faith would risk destroying humanity by making it susceptible to the beliefs and corruptions of the Immaterium, when in actuality the faith and unquestioning belief in the God Emperor of mankind would become its most powerful weapon.
That's so true, dude. He was like super worried that by allowing religion to exist, the Chaos Gods could manipulate it, but the faith of the Imperium in him is so strong that they're like untouchable by chaos. It's like literally the opposite.
Lorgar, it seems, had been right all along. Religious worship of the Emperor provided a far surer way to bind humanity together than rational thinking and science. The imperial truth would be eroded and people turned to faith. This would ultimately lead to the imperial cult, replacing the Emperor's imperial truth, and the Adeptus Ministorum, the ecclesiarchy, would become a powerful component of the Imperium. Ultimately though, while the worship of the Emperor enabled humanity to wield a powerfully binding force that was an anathema to the forces seeking to corrupt humanity, mankind's relapse into state religious worship would in time return it to a decaying, ignorant and superstitious society of ever more extreme positions, where tyrannical leaders and the abandonment of scientific progress halted humanity's advancement dead. Was this the Emperor's vision after all? Not the darkness of chaos, but the darkness of mankind's own inability to disconnect itself from superstition and faith.
The irony too, right, is that like the power of religion. Like, there's multiple accounts in Warhammer, right, of people who are so religious that they can fucking like they get psychic powers or they can do shit, right? So, like, it's like humanity abandoned its scientific advancement and then started to lean on religion, and that religion gave them powers from the warp. So now they're just the same as chaos. They're like the Emperor's demons. That's so fucking funny, dude.
Such things had left Uriah worshipping a rock in the Church of the Lightning Stone. Perhaps humanity during the golden age of mankind's greatest achievement was not
Humanity
their
is
zenith
basically the
levels
fifth
of
chaos
technology
power.
after all. Their
Or it's
greatest
be- it's- at
achievement
least it's
was
becoming
simply
that way, right?
they had reached a time where they were able to step out of the darkness, to abandon religion, spirituality, superstition, mysticism, and faith. They allowed themselves to ascend into a world of pure rationalism, science, logic, and order. Belief in the imperial truth in the modern age of the Imperium was now a literal death sentence. Any heretics who opposed the worship of the Emperor of Man must be purged from society. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war.
Good video, good video. Paranormal Truth uncovered. The Paranormal Truth uncovered the lie of the Emperor, but for the Primarchs and their Astartes, there was a deeper, more hidden truth that the Emperor was not their only father. He was gay? I'm kidding. Alright. Episode 4, A Self-Fulfilling Prophecy. Okay, this one is hour 30, man. Fuck. Alright. Should we take a break?